Hello, my name is Charmaine Ghafouri, and I'd like to welcome everyone to my research defense for my master's degree in history at Arizona State University. The title of my paper, From Battlefield to Pen, How Women's Postwar Writings Reconstructed Citizenship 1866 through 1920, focuses on the post-Civil War United States, roughly from 1866 to 1902. With an eye towards how rhetorical strategies help sustain activism through the 19th Amendment in 1920. I chose this topic because, as a 21st century woman, I have a great deal of admiration for post-Civil War women in reform. Without them, I would not have the rights afforded to me today. In my research, I discovered all of these women had different roles. They were suffragists, Black feminist club women, humanitarian reformers, and temperance leaders. But they all shared something in common. They turned their service into texts and used those texts as political arguments about who counted as a citizen. I center my work around 7 key writers: Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Clara Barton, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Susie King Taylor, Mary Church Terrell, and Frances Willard. The research question I ask is, how did women in the post-Civil War United States use writing, not just as activism, but to transform wartime service into claims to citizenship and civic authority? In researching this question, I developed a thesis where I argue that in this project, women's rights leaders did not simply point to Civil War service as proof that they deserved equality. Instead, they constructed a powerful rhetorical tradition in which editorials, speeches, memoirs, and organizational histories became a new form of political labor through which women claimed civic authority and helped redefine American citizenship. For this project, I relied heavily on primary sources accessed through the ASU Library, the Aurora Library, and the Iowa State University Archives of Women's Political Communication. The ASU Library provided digitized access to 19th century publications, including pamphlets, reform literature, and early newspaper printings. These collections were valuable because they preserved original language, formatting, and editorial framing, which allowed me to analyze how arguments were presented to contemporary audiences. The Aurora Library, similar to the ASU Library, contains extensive historical memoirs, organizational histories, and reform documents. Aurora's holdings helped me work with stable, authoritative versions of these texts. Finally, the Iowa State University Archives of Women's Political Communication was essential for sourcing speeches by Harper, Terrell, and Stanton. This archive specializes in women's oratory and provides reliable transcripts of speeches that were often reprinted inconsistently in newspapers. Because these speeches were delivered orally, being able to consult a curated collection of verified transcripts allowed me to analyze tone, rhetorical strategy, and political context with far greater clarity. The methodology used for my research combines rhetorical analysis with traditional historical inquiry. Instead of focusing solely on organizations or activism, I examined how women use writing, speeches, memoirs, editorials, and organizational histories to construct political authority. This meant closely reading each text's tone, structure, intended audience, and argumentative strategy. I followed Anthony Brundage's approach by asking key questions. What produced the source? Why was it written? What argument is being made? And what does it reveal about historical change? This framework helped me analyze each document not only as historical evidence, but as a deliberate political intervention. Historiographically, my project engages the work of scholars like Du Bois, Giddings, Jones, Sena, and Ginsburg. Much of the existing scholarship emphasizes organizational activism or legislative battles. My project shifts the lens towards self-authored political writing. It's how women framed and justified their own service in their own words. This approach also allows me to highlight Black women's intellectual leadership, showing how figures like Harper, Taylor, and Terrell expanded and challenged the rhetorical traditions established by Stanton, Anthony, Barton, and Willard. I did encounter several hurdles during research. First, the availability of primary sources was uneven. Some women published extensively, while others left limited material, making it difficult to create a balanced comparison. Second, working across multiple genres like journalism, oratory, memoirs, and institutional writing posed challenges in forming a unified methodological lens. Each genre functions differently, so aligning them with one analytical framework required really careful deliberation. Despite these challenges, this approach allowed me to trace the emergence of a rhetorical tradition through which women transferred service into political authority. The 7 key case studies I chose for my research revealed some interesting findings. We'll start with Stanton and Anthony in the Revolution, as they turned a newspaper into a political instrument, arguing that women's economic and moral labor during the war made them already citizens, in fact, if not by law. We then move on to Clara Barton's The Red Cross. She used her memoir to argue that humanitarian work was not charity, but national duty, pushing the federal government to institutionalize women's civic labor. Frances Harper's 1866 speech moved the conversation from rights to wrongs, insisting that citizenship is a moral covenant bound up with racial justice and collective responsibility. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's AERA address showed both the power and limits of moral motherhood on a basis for civic authority, especially when she suggested that educated white women should not be degraded below uneducated Black men. Susie King Taylor's memoir grounded civic authority in lived experience, marching under fire, teaching 40 children in secret schools, and she used the narrative testimony to demand recognition for Black women's wartime service. Mary Church Terrell converted that endurance into organized Black women's activism, arguing that Black club women's work in education and anti-lynching campaigns amounted to democratic reconstruction. Finally, we have Frances Willard, who extended the tradition by claiming that women's moral labor at home justified their influence over state power and public policy, even as her rhetoric rested on white domestic ideals that excluded many women of color. Together, these case studies show a tradition in which writing is the bridge between service and citizenship. It is important to note that my project does have some limitations. First, it relies on published texts and speeches from the voices of women who had some access to print culture and organizational networks. That means we hear less directly from poorer women, non-literate women, or those whose contributions circulated orally. Second, the project is US-centered and Anglophone. I don't fully explore how Indigenous women, immigrant women, or women in other regions of the Americas articulated similar or different rhetorical traditions. Third, my focus is on rhetoric and language, which means I do not track in detail how every argument translated into policy outcomes or local organizing on the ground. If I were to revise or extend this project, I would probably bring in more archival sources, like local club minutes, lesser known newspapers, or letters that show how these rhetorical strategies were received and adapted. I'd also incorporate Indigenous and immigrant women's writings to see how they challenged or reworked the same language of service and citizenship. Finally, I potentially pursue a comparative and transnational study, asking how women in other post-war or post-emancipation societies use similar rhetorical tools to claim civic authority. To conclude, the women in my study show that service alone did not guarantee citizenship. What changed the political landscape was their decision to write, to speak, and to craft narratives that argued, our labor matters, our sacrifices matter, and our voices belong in the definition of the nation. Their editorials, speeches, memoirs, and organizational texts formed a rhetorical tradition that both reflected and reshaped the meaning of citizenship in the United States. This tradition was never unified. It was marked by racial and class exclusions, by tension between moral motherhood and racial justice, and by different versions of what democracy should be. But precisely because of those tensions, it reveals that any serious account of American democracy has to grapple with race and gender together. By 1920, the 19th Amendment did more than extend the vote. It codified decades of moral argument, asserting that women's service in the nation's crises had already made them citizens, in fact, if not by law. The rhetoric of these women redefined patriotism itself. To serve was to govern, and to care was to command. Thank you for taking the time to view my research defense. It means a great deal to me that I'm able to conclude my academic journey by highlighting the voices of American women in reform and their extraordinary contributions to American history. Their persistence, resilience, and intellectual leadership shaped my project, and I am very grateful that I had the opportunity to share that with you.